In the frozen silence of a Soviet winter, buried deep beneath the Ural Mountains, a machine waited. It had no heartbeat, no mind, no fear, only purpose. Its name was Perimeter, but in the West it would come to be known as the Dead Hand. It was the Soviet Union's ultimate doomsday device, a machine built not to prevent war, but to guarantee that if the USSR ever died, the rest of the world would die with it. The men who conceived it didn't speak of deterrence anymore. They spoke of inevitability. If the Americans struck first, the machine would strike back automatically. No human order required. It was vengeance automated, apocalypse on autopilot. To understand how such a device came to exist, we must return to the late 1970s. A decade when fear had become policy and technology had outgrown its masters. The balance of terror between the superpowers had always depended on one principle: mutual assured destruction. As long as both sides could retaliate after a nuclear strike, no one would dare launch first. But by the late Cold War, the United States had begun to develop weapon systems so fast and precise that Moscow no longer believed it could retaliate in time. The deployment of Pershing II missiles in Europe meant American warheads could hit Soviet command bunkers within 6 minutes. 6 minutes from launch to impact. 6 minutes for the entire Soviet chain of command to detect, confirm, and order a counterstrike. That wasn't enough time for discussion, barely enough for panic. The Kremlin realized that its nuclear arsenal might one day die before it could even scream. Soviet paranoia wasn't entirely irrational. The United States, under Presidents Carter and later Reagan, had shifted from a doctrine of deterrence to one of counterforce. The idea that nuclear war could be fought and won if you destroyed the enemy's missiles before they could launch. Western war planners sold it as a way to limit damage. In Moscow, it sounded like a blueprint for annihilation. The Soviet leadership, already old, paranoid, and surrounded by yes men, began to imagine a scenario where the West would decapitate their command structure before they could respond. That was the seed from which the dead hand grew. In 1979, a false alarm at NORAD nearly triggered World War III. A computer glitch sent warnings of a massive Soviet missile launch hurtling across American screens. For several minutes, U.S. commanders believed the apocalypse was underway. They prepared to retaliate until verification systems confirmed it was a simulation tape accidentally loaded into a live system. The world survived by accident. But in Moscow, watching from the other side, the event confirmed a nightmare. Humans could no longer be trusted to prevent catastrophe. Machines reacted faster, colder, without doubt or hesitation. And so the Soviets decided that if war was inevitable, the act of retaliation must no longer depend on human frailty. The project began in secrecy under the supervision of the Strategic Rocket Forces, using a network of underground bunkers, radio towers, and hardened communication lines designed to survive even a full nuclear strike. At its heart was a system of sensors, seismic, radiation, and pressure detectors, that would monitor signs of nuclear attack across Soviet territory. If these sensors detected massive explosions, communication loss with the Kremlin, and radiation levels consistent with an all-out strike, the system would activate. An automated command rocket, a specially modified SS-17 ICBM, would be launched not toward the United States, but straight up into the atmosphere. From there, it would transmit coded launch orders to every remaining Soviet missile silo, submarine, and bomber still capable of firing. The message would be simple and final: launch everything. But that wasn't the scariest part. The perimeter was also built to make its own judgment calls. Soviet engineers designed it to assess the battlefield using data from satellites and ground stations. If communications with leadership were lost, and if it detected nuclear detonations combined with a pattern of electronic silence, no signals, no orders, no heartbeat, it would conclude that the Soviet Union was dead. And if the nation was dead, the machine would avenge it. It would do so without emotion, without hesitation, and without anyone left to stop it. In effect, the Soviets had built a system that could decide the fate of humanity in the absence of human beings. To ensure it couldn't be triggered by accident, Perimeter was designed with multiple safeguards. It would only activate under wartime conditions, and only after human officers initiated a go protocol. Their orders were simple. If the Kremlin vanished, if the phones went dead, and if the radiation alarms began to scream, they would unlock the system and let it think for itself. They were the last human decision in the chain of annihilation. For the men who worked on the project, there was a strange pride in the perfection of its logic. In the paranoid world of Cold War deterrence, the dead hand made sense. It was the ultimate expression of balance. If the enemy knew that even killing your leaders would not prevent retaliation, they would never strike first. In theory, it made the world safer. In reality, it placed the survival of humanity in the hands of a computer. Soviet engineers justified it with mathematics, calling it stability through automation. But what it really represented was surrender, the moment when the human race admitted it no longer trusted itself to stay alive. The irony was that even as Perimeter was being built, few outside the Soviet general staff knew it existed. Western intelligence agencies suspected that the USSR had backup communication systems for nuclear war, but no one imagined the extent of the machine's autonomy. Even within the Soviet government, the system was so compartmentalized that only a few dozen people knew its full capabilities. Some senior officials, including Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, viewed it as an unnecessary provocation, something that could terrify allies as much as enemies. Others saw it as poetic justice. If the United States wanted a decapitation strike, let them know the corpse could still bite. Construction of the dead hand's infrastructure stretched across the entire Soviet landscape. Hardened bunkers were dug into mountains, command relays were buried under layers of granite, and encrypted communication lines were threaded through forests and tundra. Each site was built to survive direct nuclear impact, with self-sustaining power, filtered air, and food stores designed to last for months. Engineers called it the city that would awaken after death. Its main control node was hidden so well that Western analysts didn't even learn its location until decades later. By the early 1980s, as U.S.-Soviet tensions reached their peak, Perimeter was almost operational. Meanwhile, the world above ground was approaching its own breaking point. The election of Ronald Reagan, with his aggressive rhetoric about the evil empire, convinced the Soviet leadership that nuclear war was no longer a distant risk. It was imminent. NATO's 1983 Able Archer exercise, which simulated a full-scale nuclear release, nearly triggered the system prematurely when Soviet radar detected unusual communication patterns. At that time, Perimeter had not yet been fully activated, but its control staff went on silent alert. Had it been live, the world might have ended not with missiles, but with a misread signal. The chilling genius of the system was its logic. Unlike human beings, Perimeter had no emotion, no doubt, and no ego. It didn't care about politics or morality. Its only function was symmetry. If one side destroyed the other, both would vanish. It was the perfect deterrent, cold, impartial, absolute. And yet buried in that perfection was madness. Because to trust a machine with the end of the world is to admit that civilization itself has failed. As one Soviet engineer later said after the Cold War, "We built a God that only wakes when we die." The true horror of the dead hand wasn't in its existence, it was in its logic. Every wire, every line of code, every relay buried beneath the Ural Mountains followed a single terrifying principle, that human beings were the weakest link in nuclear war. From its conception, Perimeter was designed to remove hesitation from the apocalypse. The Soviet leadership, haunted by memories of surprise attacks and paralyzed communication, wanted a system that would guarantee retaliation no matter what. They knew that under pressure, men might falter. They might freeze, miscommunicate, or simply die before issuing the order to strike back. A machine, on the other hand, would never panic. It would never second guess. It would simply fulfill its purpose, to make sure that if the Soviet Union burned, so would the world that lit the match. Within the complex labyrinth of bunkers and sensors, The dead hand followed an unbreakable chain of logic. First came the triggers, seismic detectors to register ground tremors from nuclear detonations, optical sensors to detect the blinding flash of atomic explosions, and radiation monitors that would flood with readings once the atmosphere was poisoned. These were connected to communication relays that constantly listened for signals from the Soviet General Staff, the Kremlin, and the Strategic Rocket Forces Central Command. As long as those signals remained alive, radio transmissions, telephone chatter, encrypted command tones, the system slept. But if those signals went dark, if silence fell over Moscow and the alarm screamed beneath the earth, the machine would wake. Once awake, Perimeter would enter what engineers called the dead hand state, a mode of terminal verification. It would check its sensors again, confirm seismic and radiation readings, measure the pulse of electronic life across the Soviet network, and determine whether its creators were still alive. If everything pointed to annihilation, if the Kremlin's command net was gone, if the military's voice channels were dead, if the surface sensors reported waves of radiation spreading like infection, then the final sequence would begin. A human operator, sealed within the central bunker, would have one last decision to make. Either deactivate the system manually or let it run its course. In training, they were taught to hesitate, to wait for a miracle, but everyone knew that if the world outside was already burning, there would be no miracle. The console before them was simple: 2 keys, 2 locks, and 1 button. The keys had to be turned simultaneously by 2 officers, the final echo of human conscience before the machine took command. Once the activation button was pressed, the machine would launch its first missile, a command rocket nicknamed the Voice of the Motherland. Unlike ordinary nuclear missiles, this rocket carried no warhead. Its payload was pure data, encrypted codes, launch instructions, and authorization signals. As it rose through the atmosphere, it would transmit a continuous stream of commands across all surviving Soviet forces. Every silo, submarine, and mobile launcher equipped to receive those frequencies would interpret the signal as a direct order from the General Staff. At that moment, the Soviet Union, dead, decapitated, silent, would speak one final time through the mechanical voice of its machine: launch. In the Strategic Rocket Forces operational manuals, the system was described clinically, almost poetically. In the event of loss of command, the voice of the state will continue. There was something profoundly human in that phrasing, as though the engineers who built the apocalypse couldn't resist giving it a soul. They spoke of the perimeter not as a weapon, but as an inheritance, a system that would carry out the will of the nation, even after the nation ceased to exist. And yet the system's perfection was also its doom. Perimeter could not be reasoned with, bargained with, or recalled. Once its conditions were met, the chain of logic would execute until the last missile fell. It didn't know victory or defeat, only balance. To destroy it, you would have to destroy everything it protected. The Americans never knew the full extent of the system, but the fragments they intercepted through intelligence hinted at something monstrous. CIA analysts in the 1980s came across references to an automatic retaliation system hidden within Soviet nuclear infrastructure. Some dismissed it as disinformation. Others, particularly those studying Soviet command theory, were terrified. They understood what it meant, that a nuclear war could one day start without anyone left alive to stop it. Ironically, Perimeter wasn't even fully trusted by the Soviet leadership. It was a weapon built by a paranoid state that feared its own people as much as its enemies. Even as it was completed, generals debated whether the system should ever be armed outside of wartime. To them, the idea of letting a computer hold the keys to global annihilation was too much, even for men accustomed to living under constant threat. And yet, by the late 1980s, as aging leaders like Brezhnev and Andropov slipped into decline, the question of control became secondary to the illusion of stability. The perimeter wasn't just a weapon, it was a political symbol, proof that the Soviet Union could not be destroyed in a single blow. It was their guarantee that even if the Kremlin fell, Even if the government evaporated into ash, the motherland would still have a voice, even if that voice came from a grave. Engineers who worked on the system described its activation drills as surreal. The control room was windowless, buried under reinforced concrete. The air smelled of oil and electricity. Red phones connected to the surface command posts stood beside consoles lined with flickering CRT monitors. Each operator sat before a panel filled with switches, meters, and indicator lights. During a drill, the room would go silent except for the hum of the machines. Then a simulated communication blackout would begin. The phones would stop ringing, the radio signals would vanish, and the computer would announce in its cold, synthetic voice, "Verification sequence commencing." One operator recalled the feeling of dread as the lights on the panel turned from green to yellow to red. "You would watch the world die in silence," he said years later, "and the only sound would be the machine breathing." For the Western world, the existence of such a device was unthinkable. It undermined every assumption of deterrence theory. If no leader needed to be alive to retaliate, then political negotiation was meaningless. What could diplomacy accomplish against an enemy that had already delegated revenge to a circuit board? The dead hand didn't just terrify the enemy, it terrified its creators. It turned the logic of deterrence inward, making even survival irrelevant. Because once you build a machine that guarantees retaliation after your death, you have already accepted that death is inevitable. By the time the system reached full operational status in 1985, the Cold War had entered its most paranoid phase. American analysts were obsessed with first strike capability. Soviet intelligence was convinced that NATO exercises were cover for a real attack. And somewhere under the Ural Mountains, perimeter waited, listening for the silence that would signal the end. In November of 1983, the world came closer to annihilation than at any point in human history. And for a few terrible hours, the system beneath the Ural Mountains stirred. NATO's exercise Able Archer 83 was meant to simulate a full-scale nuclear launch sequence complete with radio silences, encrypted messages, and mock command transfers between Western bases. To the United States, it was a test of readiness. To the Soviet Union, it looked like the beginning of the end. Soviet radar screens lit up with unusual activity, coded transmissions appeared to match wartime patterns, and NATO airfields buzzed with fighter deployments that mirrored pre-launch protocols. Inside the Kremlin, the Politburo froze. They had spent years fearing a decapitation strike, a sudden attack that would wipe out Soviet leadership before they could respond. And now everything they saw confirmed their nightmares. Soviet early warning satellites began scanning for missile launches. Command bunkers sealed their blast doors, and deep underground perimeter standby crews were ordered to their consoles. For the first time, the world's most terrifying machine was awake and listening. Inside its underground control center, the atmosphere was electric with dread. Officers sat before flickering monitors, their hands trembling over the activation keys. Radiation sensors showed nothing unusual. Seismic detectors were silent, but communication channels with Western monitoring posts were erratic. To the operators, it felt like the first beats of Armageddon. If NATO's drill crossed the line into real launch preparations, if Moscow went dark, their orders were clear. Initiate the machine. The irony was unbearable. Perimeter, built to ensure peace through certainty, was now a hair's breadth away from triggering the end through confusion. The Soviet early warning network reported conflicting data. Some radar stations in Belarus showed missile-shaped returns over the North Sea, false echoes created by atmospheric interference. Others claimed to detect aircraft heading toward Eastern Europe. The Soviet General Staff demanded confirmation, but the chain of communication was collapsing under paranoia. Every officer feared that hesitation might cost them their country. Above ground, fighter squadrons were scrambled across Warsaw Pact territory, anti-air defenses switched to combat readiness, and missile crews began warming their silos. The situation was so dire that a few generals suggested quietly activating perimeter's internal readiness mode, the sleeping eye that would monitor command networks for total silence. They didn't arm it fully, but the command was given to power up its subsystems and begin diagnostics. Somewhere deep below the Earth, the sensors flickered to life, their circuits humming as they searched for signs of apocalypse. For a few hours, the fate of humanity rested on static and suspicion. What saved the world that night wasn't reason, diplomacy, or technology. It was an accident of personality. The Soviet Union's early warning commander, General Yuri Votintsev, refused to believe the reports. He had seen false alarms before, most famously in 1983 when a malfunction in the Oko satellite network falsely signaled 5 incoming American ICBMs. That earlier event, only weeks before Able Archer, had nearly caused a launch. It was stopped by a single man, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, who decided that no sane nation would start a nuclear war with just 5 missiles. His refusal to follow protocol saved humanity from extinction. Now during Able Archer, the same kind of decision was needed again, but this time, the threat was even harder to interpret. To the system's human overseers, the silence of Moscow would be indistinguishable from destruction. The line between safety and suicide was a single missed signal. Inside the perimeter bunker, the officers waited in silence, their eyes fixed on the monitors that displayed communication links with the general staff. One by one, green lights flickered, dimmed, and then glowed again, proof that the Kremlin was still alive. Then a message arrived from Moscow. NATO's exercise had concluded. The operators exhaled as if awakening from a nightmare. The system powered down, its cold circuits returning to dormancy. The apocalypse had once again been delayed not by design, but by chance. The aftermath inside Soviet intelligence was chaos. Reports were filed detailing how dangerously close they had come to activation. The generals debated whether perimeter should even exist if it could be triggered by confusion rather than certainty. But the political leadership, especially under Andropov and later Chernenko, refused to abandon it. To them, its very existence was deterrence. If the Americans knew a machine could wipe them out automatically, they would never risk a first strike. Yet within the military, a darker realization began to spread, one whispered in corridors but never written down. If the next crisis unfolded just slightly differently, if communications failed for even a few minutes longer, the machine would have launched. The logic of perfection had turned on itself. A system designed to prevent the apocalypse had almost caused it. Western intelligence agencies remained oblivious. The CIA's analysts misinterpreted Soviet behavior during Able Archer as routine nervousness rather than existential panic. They didn't know about the dead hand, didn't know that their war game had nearly woken a creature designed to end humanity. It would take decades, long after the fall of the Soviet Union, before declassified documents revealed just how close the world had come. Historians would later call 1983 the year the world almost died twice, first through human error, then through mechanical obedience. What terrified the few Soviet engineers who knew the truth wasn't that perimeter almost activated, it was that it worked exactly as intended. It had monitored, waited, verified, and prepared. It had done everything it was designed to do, and that realization changed the way its creators thought about war forever. They understood that the next time tension rose, the machine might not sleep again. The deeper horror of that November wasn't that the system could malfunction. It was that it didn't need to. A world built on fear had created something flawless, something that couldn't be reasoned with, bribed, or scared. It was the perfect soldier, the perfect deterrent, and the perfect executioner. As one officer would later say, "For 3 hours we stared into the abyss, and the abyss stared back through a camera lens and a radar screen." By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was collapsing under its own weight, its economy failing, its satellites rebelling, and its ideology decaying. But deep beneath the mountains, the dead hand still waited. While factories closed and bread lines grew above ground, the engineers in the perimeter complex kept their routines exactly as before: diagnostic checks, communications tests, command drills. To them, the chaos of the surface world was irrelevant. The system did not care who led the country or whether the flag changed. It cared only that the censors stayed alive and that the retaliatory logic remained pure. When Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power, promising openness and reform, he inherited not just a dying empire, but a sleeping god of vengeance he barely knew existed. At first, the new leadership had no idea how automated the nuclear chain of command had become. The secrecy surrounding Perimeter was so dense that even Politburo members received only vague briefings about continuity systems. When Gorbachev's aides finally uncovered the project's details, they were horrified. Here was a weapon that, if communication collapsed during a coup or civil war, could still end the world automatically. Yet even then, dismantling it was politically impossible. Generals warned that shutting it down would signal weakness to Washington. Scientists warned that deactivation might take years since the infrastructure was woven into every missile command network. So the machine stayed alive, humming beneath a nation coming apart. As republics declared independence and the Soviet flag began to fade, Perimeter's operators continued their silent watch. They watched the August 1991 coup attempt with the same cold detachment as any other crisis. While tanks rolled through Moscow streets, underground technicians confirmed that communication lines with the strategic rocket forces remained intact. Had those lines failed, had the conspirators succeeded in severing the Kremlin from its launch bunkers, the system's logic might have interpreted the silence as nuclear death. The apocalypse could have been triggered not by foreign attack, but by a domestic power struggle. When the coup collapsed and the USSR formally dissolved months later, Western intelligence analysts assumed that Perimeter had died with it. They were wrong. The Russian Federation inherited the machine, its bunkers, its codes, its philosophy. Though funding collapsed, a skeleton crew maintained minimal functionality. Russia's early warning system was in shambles, and ironically, the old Doomsday network became the only reliable communication fallback between scattered missile divisions. By 1995, after years of neglect, the world received a chilling reminder of how alive the machine still was. On January 25th, a Norwegian research rocket launched to study the Northern Lights was mistaken by Russian radar for an incoming Trident missile. For several minutes, the Kremlin's nuclear command went to full alert. President Boris Yeltsin was given the nuclear briefcase and codes, the first and only time in history a leader opened them in real crisis. Perimeter's secondary systems were quietly armed as a precaution. If Moscow had gone dark in that moment, the machine would have awakened again. The error was caught only because analysts noticed the trajectory heading away from Russia instead of toward it. Had the angle been slightly different, humanity might have ended because of an atmospheric experiment. After that scare, Russian generals refused to let the dead hand die completely. It was renamed, upgraded, and partially automated for a new era of digital warfare. Now they called it Perimeter R, a streamlined successor integrated into satellite networks and modern launch protocols. Officially, it was a redundant communication system. But those who understood its lineage knew the truth. The logic had survived. Even today, analysts believe a modernized version still exists, ready to guarantee retaliation if Russia's leadership or command grid is destroyed. The world's most dangerous weapon outlived the empire that built it, because the idea behind it was stronger than the state. It was pure survival stripped of morality. The fall of the Soviet Union did not end the age of the Doomsday machine. It proved that once humanity creates something meant to ensure destruction, it never truly disappears. Like radiation, it decays slowly, but never completely. And in the darkness of Russia's secure bunkers, somewhere behind blast doors that haven't opened in decades, red lights still blink in rhythm with the old heartbeat of the Cold War. Today, the dead hand is no longer spoken of in official Russian documents, yet it has never been denied either. Military spokesmen describe it as a reserve command communication network, a phrase vague enough to comfort civilians while terrifying anyone who understands history. The true legacy of Perimeter is not that it still exists, but that it has become an idea embedded in modern warfare. A reminder that technology built to ensure survival often guarantees destruction instead. In Moscow's new doctrine of escalate to de-escalate, echoes of the old logic remain. If Russia is cornered, the retaliation will be automatic, overwhelming, and absolute. Analysts believe the updated Perimeter R system is fully integrated with satellite telemetry, hypersonic delivery platforms, and nuclear-powered cruise missiles like Burevestnik. In theory, if Russian command and control are destroyed, the system can now issue global launch commands across multiple vectors, ensuring that even the death of leadership triggers retaliation. It is the same song played in a modern key, yet in a cruel twist of history, the United States is not innocent of imitation. American defense planners, alarmed by Russia's automation, quietly developed their own semi-automated launch continuity programs, ensuring retaliation through artificial intelligence-assisted decision trees. The nightmare born in the Urals has metastasized into the bloodstream of global defense. Every superpower now maintains some variant of the dead hand, hidden behind euphemisms like fail-safe command architecture or continuity of deterrence. What began as one nation's paranoid insurance policy has become a worldwide religion of annihilation. The most haunting part of this legacy is how invisible it has become. Ordinary citizens go about their lives unaware that beneath their feet, machines still listen for the sound of the end. They check seismic sensors, monitor radiation levels, and ping command frequencies, just as they did 40 years ago. Somewhere in a bunker, operators still perform drills for an event they hope never comes, turning keys they pray will never fit. And outside, the rest of the world scrolls through news feeds, oblivious to how close the abyss truly is. The dead hand was supposed to die with the Soviet Union, but like a ghost it lingers, reborn in new steel, new software, and new fears. It is not the hardware that endures, but the idea that humanity cannot trust itself. Once a civilization accepts that it might die by accident, it has already surrendered the most important part of its sanity. The story of the dead hand is not just about one machine, but about an age that taught computers to finish what humans started. It is the story of men who feared being unable to fight back and build a system that could fight without them. It is the story of deterrence pushed beyond morality, of logic perfected to the point of insanity, and it is the story of how, even in the 21st century, the Cold War never truly ended. It simply went underground. In the silence of the bunkers, in the hum of dormant circuits, the machine still waits, indifferent, eternal. If the world ever ends, it may not be by choice, but by the patient fulfillment of a command written decades ago by men who believed they were protecting humanity. The dead hand does not dream, it does not judge, it only listens. And somewhere it still listens now.